Greetings, it's the Digital Dog. And what I have for you today is a fairly exhaustive video tutorial on color gamut, color gamuts and images, color gamuts and RGB working spaces, color gamut and RGB output spaces, all plotted in either 2 or 3D in ColorThink Pro. So I have an introductory first few slides that I will show so that we're all on the same page. You can skip ahead and go right to the second chapter if you wish, but I recommend you watch this. When you're looking at a digital image, you're simply looking at sometimes millions of solid square colored pixels, and each one of those pixels has an RGB number. RGB numbers by themselves don't tell us what a color looks like. We need to know what color space these particular numbers refer to. So color management and ICC profiles give these color numbers an associated color space. I'm going to look at this very quickly and then we'll move on, but this is very important to keep in mind, especially for those of you who like working by the numbers. Now, you know that we can define a color in Photoshop or other imaging applications numerically, for example, 233 red, 45 green, 89 blue, but what does that color look like? In other words, multiple color spaces can all have the same 3 sets of RGB numbers, but all those different numbers are defining a different color. By the way, this is Gamut. He's one of my 3 whippets. Just to show you how serious I am about Gamut. Now over here on the right side of the slide, you're seeing what is visible light, the light that we humans can see. And it's only a very small sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. Expanded up above, you see that visible light is these particular colors as passed through a prism. You might remember Roy G. Biv. Well, thanks to some math done in the 1930s, the visible light spectrum can be plotted two-dimensionally, and that is what you're seeing in this horseshoe-shaped plot. This is the gamut of human vision. Anything that falls outside this particular horseshoe shape is not visible to us. We can't see ultraviolet and infrared light. We can only see visible light. So you could say that those electromagnetic wavelengths are outside the gamut of human vision. So when we talk about gamut, this is the big gamut that everything else is contained within. Now here plotted on this particular gamut of human vision, which by the way is called the spectrum locus, you see where the most saturated green color, which would be G255 0 red 0 blue, would lie within human vision, exactly in that spot. These numbers now tell us exactly how a color should appear to the average or standard observer or average human. Adobe RGB 1998 also uses G255 red 0 blue 0 to define its most saturated green, and you can see it's a completely different color. It's in a different portion of color space, the color space of human vision. In terms of gamut and working spaces, ideally what we want to do is we want to capture all the colors we possibly can from our digital capture device, and then we want to archive that and use that down the line. Now, if we're shooting raw data, that's possible. So think about gamut-like resolution. You want as much as you can possibly get. You want to export that raw data in full resolution ProPhoto 16-bit for your masters. If you're working in Adobe RAW converters like Camera Raw or Lightroom, it's using ProPhoto RGB primaries for its processing. You're using ProPhoto anyway, so why would you want to reduce the color gamut any further than you have to at this point? Just encode and export as 16-bit ProPhoto RGB. Keep in mind there's no such thing as an sRGB printer. There are printers that expect to be sent sRGB for output, and then their RGB data at this point is converted to an output color space. But that doesn't mean that the printer is an sRGB printer. And as we look at sRGB gamuts and printer gamuts, I think you'll see they're vastly different. So at this point, let's summarize, and let's look at the 3 big RGB working spaces. Color spaces designed for archiving and editing our images. sRGB, Adobe RGB 1998, ProPhoto RGB, when and where you'd want to use these particular RGB working spaces. In the case of the examples I'm about to show you, you'll see where when you do not use ProPhoto RGB as your master encoding color space, you'll be clipping a lot of colors that you can actually use for reproduction. So let's take a look now at color spaces in ColorThink Pro. We're in ColorThink Pro, and we're going to quickly look at graphing sRGB and let's say Adobe RGB, and just look at the gamuts in 2 dimensions. Let's start simple. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pick, it's under favorites or installed, in this case we'll pick sRGB from favorites. And so what you're seeing now here is a 2-dimensional gamut plot of sRGB. If I come down and I select the spectrum locus here, you can now see how sRGB plots within the gamut of human vision. And let's go and also now pick another color space, also under favorites, Adobe RGB. So here you can see the green primary in Adobe RGB is a much more saturated color within human vision than the green primary that we see in sRGB. So this is a very simple way of looking at the two on top of each other in 2 dimensions, but where things get interesting is when we click and look at them in 3 dimensions. Let me zoom back out a little bit and I'll show you what's going on here. You can see the horseshoe-shaped plot, the spectrum locus. For now, let's turn that off to make things a little easier. And what we're looking at now is Adobe RGB in 3 dimensions. So before it was a very simple looking triangle, but when we look at it in 3 dimensions, we can see it's a little bit different in terms of its shape. Although it is a very simple shape, we'll see when we compare it to output color spaces that this is indeed a very simple shape. What do we have here? 2 simple triangular shapes. That's because we have sRGB sitting inside of Adobe RGB. What I can do is simply lower the opacity of Adobe RGB, and we can see sRGB has a very, very similar shape. It just has a smaller color gamut as we spin it around. So here we're seeing the primary differences in color gamut between sRGB and Adobe RGB. These translucent areas are the gamut of Adobe RGB, and you can see it is significantly larger than sRGB. Here we are in ColorThink, and I have 2 color spaces that I'm plotting. The first one is sRGB, and you can see it's a very simple shape. As we've discussed in the notes, RGB working spaces are defined by simply plotting the 3 primary colors in color space, red, green, and blue. Here is a profile for my Epson 3880, and you can see that it is a vastly different shape. Nothing like the simple RGB working spaces that we work with, whether they be sRGB, ProPhoto, Color Match, Adobe RGB. They all have very simple, predictable shapes. Output profiles don't. So let's take a look at these 2 in 3D and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. Here's my printer profile in 3D. And you can see it's anything but a very simple shape. And this is what we kind of expect from output devices. And each one of them are going to be different. I'm going to plot sRGB on top of it, put it in a single color, and I'll just slide down the opacity. And what you can see is that we've got this very simple sRGB red shape and a lot of the very complicated, oddly shaped printer profile falling outside its gamut. Significantly wider gamut in the teals and blues, the greens, the yellows. In other words, if I were to use sRGB here, I'm going to slice away all these useful colors that my printer can print. While we're here, let's look at Adobe RGB. We'll give it a single color, green. We'll slide down its opacity. And let's turn off sRGB. And as you can see, even using Adobe RGB 1998, there are a lot of colors that my printer can print that Adobe RGB cannot contain, cannot define or record. Look at all these saturated blues, these saturated magentas and reds, and then this nice little bit of yellow along here. If I plot my Epson 4900, it's going to be even a larger difference in color gamut. One of the reasons that we need these large RGB working spaces is because their shapes are really simple, like these triangles that we saw. Output color spaces are complex and have weird areas where Certain colors will jump out of Gamut. So in order to contain them, we really need a big, simple, triangular shape. So for example, if we look at ProPhoto RGB, let's give it a single color, this time blue, and slide down the opacity. And let's turn off the Adobe RGB. Now with ProPhoto RGB, we have absolutely no restrictions. It can contain all the colors that I could possibly print to this particular printer and many, 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 many other printers. It's tremendous. But it's tremendous because we need to have really big RGB working spaces, which are very simple in shape, in order to contain all these very strange output colors that might pop out of Gamut. And that's one of the reasons why we have this disconnect in size. So what we have here are the Gamut plots from two Contone silver-based printers, which many people attribute to being the so-called sRGB printers. One's a Noritsu, and we'll also see a LightJet. Just so that you can see that when you build a custom profile of these particular devices and plot their gamuts, you see that they don't behave like sRGB at all. As you can see, when you map the 3D gamuts of these two printers, they really aren't anything like sRGB. And in the case of the LightJet, it has a considerably larger color gamut than sRGB. The other problem with these just send us sRGB workflows is that without having the actual profile that you can use to convert, you can't control the rendering intent. Whether you use a perceptual or a relative colorimetric intent, you can't post-edit the file, you can't control whether you're using black point compensation. In terms of a color managed workflow, this is half-baked. So here I am in Photoshop CS6, and what I wanted to do is try to correlate sort of the idea of color gamut and color numbers and color spaces in sort of a Photoshop-centric way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to make a new document. And I'm going to call this ProPhoto RGB. And I'm going to make it 1 pixel wide by 3 pixels high. Doesn't matter what the resolution is. What is important is that in this case I pick ProPhoto RGB down here for the color space. I'm going to go OK. And this dinky little image will appear. And what we'll do is just zoom into it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my eyedropper tool, make sure it's set to point sample, and then I'm going to come down and pick the pencil so that I get a single pixel, and it's time to build some color. So I'm going to go into my color picker, and I'm going to pick the most saturated red that I can, which is numerically R255, 0 green, 0 blue. And there's red. Let's do the same for green. We can get close in the ballpark here. And then just make sure that R is 0, green is 255, blue is 0. Red, green, let's do blue. Okay, 0, 0, 255. And now all I have to do is just save it, which I've already done. Now let's do one other thing before we move on. Here's our info palette, and let's just go over and make sure that we can see that our red square is R255, 0 green, 0 blue, green, 0, 255, 0, blue, 0, 0, 255. No problem. Let's do one other thing before we move on. Let's go and say, edit, convert to profile, and actually convert this to sRGB. And it doesn't really even matter what we select here. Take my word for it. You can experiment and do this yourself, or you can just take my word for it. I'll pick perceptual. It's not going to matter what rendering intent I pick here. I'm going to say convert from ProPhoto to sRGB. And let's look at our values now. R25500, 0, 255, 0, 255. And if you don't believe that I'm in sRGB, you should see here it says sRGB in my window. And I could come up here and do a file save as and save as sRGB. which I've already done. Okay, so we have two different documents. They have the same 3 RGB values, but they're in 2 different color spaces. Let's go and look at how this might be analyzed in ColorThink. Here I am in ColorThink. I'm going to open up the image that I just made. Here's the sRGB 1x3 pixel TIFF. I'm going to open it up, and in this case, boy, we get 3 colors that we can plot in 3D. Hopefully you can see them spinning around in color. Hey, how do they compare with sRGB? Well, let's check. We'll go into Favorites, sRGB. Oh my goodness, let's just look at them in 2 dimensions. My, they plot exactly. No reason why they shouldn't. Let me go in here real quickly and just turn down the opacity. And there are my 3, red, green, and blue colors that I made in Photoshop. And the same thing will happen if I were to bring in ProPhoto RGB. I'm back in Photoshop, and I just wanted to show you something very quickly in terms of RGB working spaces and their DNA. I'm going to go into my color settings, which is Command or Control Shift K, and you'll notice here under my RGB working spaces I have selected ProPhoto RGB. One of the things that you can do is you can select these different RGB working spaces that are installed by Adobe. Let's say sRGB. And you can immediately then come up to Custom RGB. And what you're going to see here is the DNA, if you will, the 3 specifications that define the sRGB color space. sRGB has a complex tone response curve, so Photoshop, not being able to show us that, is saying simplified sRGB, but nonetheless, one of the attributes of an RGB working space is its gamma encoding. We have the white point and these RGB primary locations that can be plotted to define those particular colors. And we saw something like that when we were viewing the 2-dimensional colors in ColorThink. We can go in and actually plot XY coordinates and see where red, green, and blue primaries fall, and that's how these color spaces are defined. If I go back into ProPhoto RGB and then select Custom, here you see the attributes that define ProPhoto RGB. So currently I'm in Lightroom 4, and I have a collection of a number of images that I thought we would look at least some of them in 3D in ColorThink Pro. We'll look at their color gamuts. Some of these images I pick because they have fairly saturated colors, others because they don't, or they only have some areas of saturated colors. Let me show you how I went ahead and prepared these images so that they can be used in ColorThink. All of these images here are either captured on a Canon 5D or 5D Mark II, and they were all RAW files. And what I basically did is I just went into export, and I have a custom export that I made. And I just want to show you that I exported all of the images in ProPhoto RGB, in 8-bit, and as TIFF files. And more importantly, that they were all resized so that they are 300 pixels along the long axis. In order to bring images into ColorThink, we need fairly low resolution images, otherwise the product runs quite slowly. Let's take a look at this particular image of these 2 gals on the phone. We have very saturated colors in the shirt, but pretty desaturated colors in the background. We'll go into ColorThink. Let's go in here and say open, and let's pick girls on phone. So now what we're seeing are the actual colors of those girls on the phone in comparison to sRGB. And as I spin it around, you can see that there are a lot of colors that fall outside sRG gamut. A lot of the saturated blues, some of those dark and saturated greens, and if we look down here, a lot of these reds are clipped. That's data that we were actually able to capture on the camera and encode. I happen to save that as ProPhoto, but had I selected sRGB, these colors would all clip. that are outside this particular shape. All these reds and greens and so on would have been lost. I'm lowering the opacity of the sRGB gamut so that we can see through it, give you a better idea of the image itself that we've just plotted. So once again, the image that you're seeing here was the girls on the phone. You can see the colors that are out of sRGB gamut. Let's turn off the girls. Let's look at another image. Let's see. This is a rather interesting image because in this particular case, we have an image that doesn't have a lot of color gamut, except for this little ring around the eye of the bird. Now, in this particular case, I think that's an important attribute, and I want that on my print to really pop, because that's what the bird in my recollection looked like. But as you can see, the rest of the image is very low gamut. So let's plot this in ColorThink and see what it looks like. Okay, bird with red eye is now open. Let's spin it around and compare it to sRGB. Oh, interesting. Overall, you can see inside this particular image is almost completely contained within sRGB. And remember, when we were looking at the image, we were seeing how much of it was kind of monochromatic and didn't have a lot of color. I'm going to zoom in here, and you can see inside sRGB, here's all that sort of monochromatic, not very saturated imagery. But the red eye, look at it, it's right here, falling outside of sRGB gamut, all these red colors here. And I want to print those colors out, so that's kind of disappointing. All right, let's turn that off and take a look at another image. Let's go back into Lightroom. Let's see. Here's Jack, my electrician. And here's one of those images where you'd think, that should pretty much fall into sRGB. It's just a simple portrait. There's not a lot of saturated colors. Let's check how it works out when we plot the gamut of this image against sRGB in ColorThink. We're back in ColorThink. We've loaded the image of Jack. And as we spin it around, well, pretty much the entire image falls within sRGB. There are some colors that do fall outside, some very dark but saturated. These are probably reds or greens. Let's see, it looks like some reds and yellows and so on. So in this particular case, yep, sRGB was just fine for Jack. Let's take a look at this portrait of Rob. Now, we've got more saturation here. It's a sunset shot. It's pretty nice, warm light. Let's see how that plots in ColorThink. Here we are looking at sRGB in the Rob portrait. Okay, this is a little interesting. We've got a lot of saturated colors that are falling outside sRGB in our reds and some yellows over here and some dark blues. Well, let's go take a look at the image. Well, this makes sense. Here's our dark blues. We'll wait for Lightroom to update. Got some very saturated dark colors in here and some very saturated colors in the background here. Okay, this is a fun image. Here we've got a very foggy morning in Mendocino. So let's take a look and see. I'll bet you anything, this easily falls well within sRGB. So here I am in ColorThink. Here's sRGB and that foggy Mendo morning shot, and my goodness, look at that. It's got a tiny little color gamut. It really illustrates how scene gamut plays a role in what we capture. It's just this monochromatic image. And let's look at a real black and white image. Here's an image that I actually converted to black and white in Lightroom. Let's see how that plots in ColorThink. Okay, that's pretty wild. Look how this black and white image plots. It's absolutely neutral from our highlight, our whitest white, pretty much down to our blackest black. Gets a little weird down here in terms of linearity and neutrality, but it's pretty close. But that's a fascinating way to look at a particular image. Okay, back in Lightroom, let's do one more. This is an interesting image because it's got pretty saturated blues and these really cool orange colors on the piranha. Let's see how these plot. Okay, back in ColorThink, we're still plotting sRGB, and in this case on top of the piranha fish image. Let's zoom out just a little bit and zoom around. And boy, there's our blue background, the fish you're laying on, and boy, is it getting clipped. Is that out of gamut there? And then how about that orange on the fish? We're seeing some out of gamut colors over here as well. Not a great deal, But still, there's information in the image that I was able to capture that sRGB doesn't allow me to use. All right, let's go back to this image here of the girls on the phone. And here we are. We've seen that this image has a lot of out of gamut red colors, blues, greens in sRGB. Let's turn off sRGB and see how it compares to Adobe RGB. Here again is just the image. Now we see Adobe RGB over the image, translucent to some degree, and you can see that even Adobe RGB is going to clip these very nice blue colors and some of these red colors and some of these green colors because Adobe RGB just is not large enough in terms of being a color space to contain the colors I've captured. ProPhoto RGB obviously is. These images all came from ProPhoto RGB. So here's a particular problem. If I use sRGB, I'm going to clip a boatload of colors. And even if I use Adobe RGB, I'm going to clip colors that I can reproduce. But let's look at reproduction right now. I will turn off Adobe RGB, and let's compare this image that came from a raw file in ProPhoto to a particular printer that I use quite often. I'm going to go down to this list, and I'm going to pick installed a profile for Premium Luster 3880. And here you can see that, well, the printer is fairly large gamut, but there are still colors that are going to fall out of gamut when I print them. The bottom line, though, is that I've captured all these particular colors, and I can contain them in my RGB working space, that being ProPhoto RGB. As printers get wider and wider gamut, hopefully more of these colors will be reproducible. But right now, at least I have all the colors that my camera could provide to me in my raw converter, and I can send those out to my printer. Here's another image I think would be fun to look at, which is this sunset image, shot with a really long lens. I didn't go crazy in Lightroom messing around with vibrance or anything. Let's see how this plots in ColorThink because it's really interesting. So here's sRGB, the somewhat translucent gamut, and inside sRGB, that's the sunset image. And here's where working with 3 dimensions gets really interesting. As we start to spin this around, look at that. That is the saturated colors in the sunset image that are falling outside of sRGB. I'm going to actually click on the sRGB gamut and move it almost all the way down. And you're now looking at the sunset image. Very interesting. But also the number of colors in the sunset image that fall outside of sRGB. Let's compare it to ProPhoto RGB. As I move the opacity of the ProPhoto gamut down, you can see it fully contains the colors in the image, which makes sense since it came from ProPhoto itself. So here I am in ColorThink Pro, and it probably looks a little confusing. So let's just take this piece by piece, because I've done a lot of the work ahead of time so that you don't have to watch this product calculate what it has to calculate. Over here on the left side, what I've done is I've actually imported into ColorThink Pro the image that we saw in Lightroom, exported as a 300 pixel image to ProPhoto RGB. I also exported it in sRGB. So now we have 2 300 pixel along the long axis images, one in ProPhoto and one in sRGB. And I can just bring them into ColorThink. And what's very, very neat about ColorThink is I can click on this little pop down, and it's grayed out because I've already done it, but I've selected Convert All Colors to List. And as soon as I do that, about 45 seconds or a minute later, ColorThink goes through and it actually creates what's called a color list that you can see below this image. These are all of the RGB colors that it found throughout this particular image in ProPhoto. I did the same thing over here, and I said convert all colors to color list, and it made another color list over here. And what's interesting is that in both cases, whether it's ProPhoto RGB or sRGB, the color lists have exactly the same number of colors. In this case, ColorThink was able to extract 54,600 colors from these two particular images. And let's just zoom in here real quickly because I want you to see that in the case of ProPhoto RGB, our RGB values and their associated lab values are different than the RGB and associated lab values from the sRGB file, which makes sense. They're in two different color spaces. So that's all you're seeing here are color lists of 54,600 colors. And one of the things that I'm able to do whenever I have two side-by-side color lists in lab is I can do something called a delta E report. And what I can do is I can compare the differences in colors between everything on the left and everything on the right. And I've done that here. And over on this right side, we have two ways of looking at these reports. One is visual and one is numeric. So for the visually inclined, let's look at this first. What you're basically seeing here, it's a little bit like the out of gamut overlay you see in Photoshop, except it's way more useful and based on real data that we have here. Basically, what we're looking at is a metric of a delta E. We're using a delta E 2000 calculation for the geeks out there. And essentially anything that you see that has a delta E of a value of 1 or less is shown to us overlaid in green. So a 1 or less is really imperceivable. It's virtually impossible for us to see the difference between a delta E of 1 or less. And here you're seeing all the green colors are the differences between these two images and these two color spaces that we can't see. But as the values increase, so do the colors. As we get to a delta E of 2.5, all of a sudden those higher values are yellow, and as we get at a delta E of 4.5 and higher, where colors are definitely recognizably different, we have a red overlay. And it's very interesting. You can see in the image that the out of gamut colors between the two, the big differences between these two images lay here within these saturated colors in this gal's shirt. And very little difference, almost, well, not almost, completely imperceivable differences in so much of this particular image in the background. Even the blue within this telephone dome is imperceivably different. Here we can see where the rubber meets the road, where actually visually what are the differences between sRGB and ProPhoto RGB for this particular image. The other thing I've done is I've plotted the individual colors by maximum delta E, and I can click here and sort by max or min, and I can sort any of these particular columns. It takes quite a lot of time, so I wanted to have this set up for you. But what you're seeing here is that the highest value that's different between these two images has a delta E of 9.88, and that's quite high. Remember, a delta E of 1 or less is imperceivable, and as the value increases, the differences become more and more visible. So right here, what we're just looking at is a very simple difference between sRGB and ProPhoto RGB, both visually and using a metric called delta E in terms of color gamut. And number of colors are the same. So the encoding, the 24-bit color file, whether it's ProPhoto RGB or sRGB, has the same number of colors, but the saturated colors that we're seeing here are quite different, and ColorThink allows us to see exactly where they are different visually on any two images. So once I have this completely set up to give me this delta E report, one of the things that I can do is I can come here to this particular set of data, the differences between the two, and I can say graph list. And about a minute and a half later, ColorThink goes through the process of now mapping three-dimensionally these two images. So again, we have one in sRGB and one in ProPhoto. But because we did it using this particular process, ColorThink draws what it calls vectors. So let me zoom in on this and I'll show you what you're going to see here. You can probably see that if we really zoom in, you see a point and a line and another point. And what you're seeing here are called vectors. On one end of this point is, in this case, I'm going to say the sRGB red, and on the other end is the ProPhoto red. And as we move through these two color spaces combined on top of each other, it gives you a very interesting perspective on how the colors are different between the two color spaces. and I'll spin it around here slowly, and you can see some colors are very close to each other in sRGB versus Pro. Other colors are extremely different from each other. And it just gives us another way of zooming into an image and the image's color space and seeing where the two color spaces differ. So as we get out into these wider areas of blue, for example, let's zoom in here. You can see the significant difference between this point of color in sRGB, which is a very saturated but dark blue, and this point over here, which is in ProPhoto RGB. Back in Lightroom, I just wanted to quickly point out something to be aware of. We're working in a very wide gamut editing space. Here in Lightroom and in Camera Raw, we're using ProPhoto Primary. So we have some very saturated colors, and we need to be careful that we don't overdo it. And one thing people say is, well, my monitor has a gamut that's much smaller than my working space, so I'm actually going to be doing things in my editing software that I can't see on screen. And that's absolutely true. You do need to be careful, especially when you're doing something like working with either vibrance or saturation. So here's something that I would suggest that you do. At least in Lightroom, one of the things you can do is you can make the interface as wide as it can be so you have a bit more granularity over these sliders. But the tip is basically this. As you move one of these particular sliders, if as you're moving it, you fail to see at a certain point the preview updating on screen, you're moving it and it just doesn't seem to be getting any more saturated on screen, this would be a sign that you are now affecting colors that are out of display gamut that may be in the document itself. And you may want to back off a little bit. That's one way you can work with very wide gamut data on a smaller gamut device, such as display, and not get yourself into trouble by editing colors you're not actually viewing.